Hi, my name is Heather Havenwood, and welcome. Welcome to the first episode of Hope on the Other Side of the Door with your host, Dr. Ken Campos. Dr. Ken, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good morning, Heather.
Good morning. So this is your first introduction about your show, and I want everyone to know who you are, a little bit about you. So Dr. Ken Campos is an experienced psychiatrist with a demonstrated history of working in the mental health care field. He is passionate about enhancing the quality of life for those suffering with schizophrenia and their caregivers. After 25 years of helping patients in hospitals and prevention centers, he saw the need to help caregivers and family members to cope with and create a community for them to get support. He hopes to change the fear and stigma against severe mental illness and schizophrenia. Dr. Ken Campos is on a quest to help caregivers to do that, and now he produces Hope on the Other Side of the Door podcast, a bi-monthly show where he interviews practitioners, caregivers, family members, and other community support resources. He is passionate about creating a clearing for a balanced, respectful life for those with schizophrenia and their caregivers internationally. You can find him at drkencampos.com. Thank you, Dr. Ken.
Yes, thank you too, Heather. I appreciate that wonderful introduction.
Absolutely. So let's just start with the name of the show, right? Hope on the Other Side of the Door. Why did you name it Hope on the Other Side of the Door?
Well, in my professional career, 20 of those many years was spent in closed, locked hospitals. And that's the phrase that the industry uses, the mental health care industry uses for facilities that have a locked door. And often the whole building may be locked if it's a freestanding psychiatric hospital. And then I spent 6 years in a state hospital that had a sally port with 3 metal doors that were operated by some guards. And then there'd be units inside that could be locked and seclusion rooms that will be locked if someone has extreme behavioral disturbance. So the door is a huge symbol of the work I've done, and it represents really the worst part of a person with schizophrenia's life experience in the mental health field.
Mm. I can understand that. And you mentioned when we were talking at one point that you had a personal experience with that, and that when you see someone that you love and care about, and you saw so many caregivers in your lifetime, people that they absolutely love and adore their friends and family, or their family member, and then there's this like kind of door that gets closed, and they just have this hope for things to get better. And so that's why I think that's why you told me another reason why that is called Hope on the Other Side of the Door. And I want to talk to you a little bit about, ask you questions about your experience in 25 years of mental health and overall, and now you want to focus on schizophrenia. Why are you focusing specifically on schizophrenia and helping their caregivers?
Mm-hmm. Yes, for me, it was sort of a personal quest, and it is a little bit philosophical, and it relates to the mind and awareness. And as growing up, I was very curious about the natural world, physics, astronomy, that sort of thing. And then also growing up here in America, in a Christian Sunday school in the early days of my life, there was this story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the knowledge of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So that whole idea of consciousness and awareness was huge for me. And something like psychosis and schizophrenia represents a huge shift and a huge change in that. So it became kind of a philosophical and scientific area of interest to me on the one hand. The other part of it is just human compassion for the suffering. And going through medical school, and I taught medical students kind of pro bono teaching for 12 years, I would advise the young students to look at a part of medicine that really interests them at a human level, at a really personal level, because they'll be doing that kind of work for years and years in their life as a professional physician. And so for me, the part that attracted me the most had to do with that philosophical and religious, spiritual idea of consciousness, awareness, judgment, what's right and wrong. And so that led me to psychosis and then to schizophrenia.
And, in just talking to you and getting to know you, I know that you have multifaceted connections. You talk about philosophical and whatnot. Tell us more, because this show that you really created is really not just for what I call the chemistry side or the psychiatrist side, right? Which is more clinical. It's also more holistic piece because of your background. And can you share your view on that and how you want to help not only people with schizophrenia, but all their caregivers and the people that are really impacted by that at a holistic level?
Yes, and for me, the journey toward holism and being holistic and integrative and complementary in my approach to medicine started with, my scientific early training. I was at the California Institute of Technology, and in my biology classes, I got to work with neuroscientists, and we even got to repeat some Nobel Prize-winning experiments on brains, on living animals. So this was fascinating. And then I spent 4 years at the National Institute of Mental Health, being a neurochemist. And I saw that the scientific approach leads you to a certain level, but in my residency, my teachers also talked about the art of medicine. And psychiatry is very artful. And so then looking towards other things in addition to the concrete antipsychotic drugs and neurochemistry seemed to be a more expanded way of looking at and approaching this really human condition that's so human, and there's so much suffering when the person is very, very sick at the time, and then their family members have some suffering as well. So my motivation with the podcast is to help alleviate and reduce that human suffering and bring more joy and compassion into people's lives and more fulfillment in their day-to-day existence.
So you and I were talking earlier about some of the guests that you want to have on this show, and that who do you feel is listening. So let's talk about that. First of all, let's talk about what kind of guests are going to be on this show, what kind of resources and that you want to really bring, that you obviously you have met many, many people in your 25 years, holistically as well as clinically. So you're going to bring a variety, but I wanted to just kind of have you talk about what are the kinds of resources and people that you want to bring onto the show.
hmm Yes, so starting with the close to home MD part, there would be other psychiatric colleagues, people from my local medical school here at UC San Diego School of Medicine, some psychiatrists that I've known who've been involved in the WPA, the World Psychiatric Association, researchers, people along in that dimension. The other was going to be integrative and complementary practitioners. So people that practice things like Ayurvedic medicine. And there's been a little bit of bringing some herbal treatments to psychosis and schizophrenia. Already research is going on in that direction. Traditional Chinese medicine, bring some of those things in. And then there's other things that will be important for the caregivers to get the balance and serenity in their own life, like yoga practitioners, meditation teachers, because the self-care for the caregiver is going to be key so that they have a foundation from which to take care of the person, their loved one with schizophrenia.
Yeah, it's some of the ones that you discussed with me, like Reiki, energy healers, yoga, people that can really help the caregiver get grounded themselves, forgiving themselves. You were mentioning to me at one point that many times you find that when you are talking to the caregivers, there's a shame, or they feel like they did something wrong. And that you were really wanting to create this show and this podcast to bring resources, but to really bring a community of caregivers together so they can have a place that they can talk about what they're moving through.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this brings to mind the idea of the so-called body-mind integration.
Yeah.
Here in the West, scientifically for several hundred years, we've had this split between the body and the mind. And I think in the recent decades, thinkers and philosophers and biologists are realizing, no, it's a really more integrated thing, both for the person with the schizophrenic illness. Hormonal things are going to be important. Diet, exercise is very important. I see that it's going to be part of their care for the person with the schizophrenia. And then for the caregivers themselves, to really integrate that body-mind way of thinking. Personally, I've had over 120 acupuncture treatments myself as the acupuncture patient. So I'm really quite open to and have experienced positive benefits with some of these alternative and complementary treatments.
Yeah, complementary treatments. I love that. So I love the fact that this whole show is going to bring what I call two worlds together. It's the holistic side, the energetic side, right? As well as the chemistry and the Western philosophy of the chemistry and psychiatric side. I think that's really important for people to know what this podcast is about. So I highly suggest everyone subscribe. If you're a caregiver of someone with schizophrenia or mental illness, or you know someone that is dealing with that, I highly, basically, I highly invite you to subscribe. Can you talk about at all any of the stats you have from the United States or certain areas of the United States of the number of people that's dealing with schizophrenia and or mental illness in their family?
Mhm. Some years ago, the American Psychiatric Association did a many-year-long, 10-plus-year study to look at the prevalence of mental illness in the United States. And it turns out it's many times more patients that have some kind of diagnosable mental illness than there are psychiatrists to treat mental illness. So a lot of people in the community who have a mental illness condition are treated by family doctors, general practitioners, or internists. In fact, I'm working one day a month at a clinic in San Diego, and that doctor there said, "Hey, I need some help." And so that physician has been treating mentally ill people. So I've taken over part of that caseload. And so being able to address this condition is going to be so important, I think.
It's not only important for the caregiver and the patient, but it's also great for society to really release the stigma of the name and the word. And that was one thing that you and I talked about, is that part of your intention with this show is to help people break the stigma, and the stigma of being ashamed of talking about it, being ashamed of maybe having someone in their family that has it, because there's definitely a stigma to sharing with people, their parent, their loved one, their significant other, their brother or sister has schizophrenia. There's a huge shame that you told me about. You also share that the caregivers feel isolated. The whole focus is on the patient and not maybe them, and making sure they're taken care of.
Yes, this is so important to deal with some of those issues for the caregivers. And in terms of the statistics and how common this is, schizophrenia occurs in every race. It's on every continent of the planet. It's about 1% is the lifetime relative risk of developing schizophrenia. And in the United States, there's about a little under 1%. It's about 2.2 million people that have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and close to 200,000 of them are homeless. So my compassion and my heart for this illness and this condition, this psychotic illness called schizophrenia, this thought disorder illness, is huge. And for me, with this podcast, to support the caregivers will be to give them the strength and the resilience to move forward in forming a meaningful, good relationship with their adult child, or if it's the adult children that have a mom and dad with schizophrenia, that's possible, to help them really care for that person and keep the family unit intact, so we don't end up with so many homeless people. And this is just a national tragedy, I think, to have this illness, and the stigma is terrible. And working with the podcast and getting the message out there to help reduce and alleviate that stigma and shame is going to be so important. And so I hope also to create communities of support to add to the already existing communities of support that are there already.
Got it. So I just wanted to share it with everybody here. If you know somebody who is suffering with schizophrenia, or their caregivers, or just if you know anyone in that world, I highly suggest that you share this and, reach out to Dr. Ken at his website, drkencampos.com, or his LinkedIn profile, which is also Dr. Ken Campos. That's Campos. He wants to hear from you because he also wants to know what you're dealing with and what you're struggling with and what your challenges are. And he wants to be able to bring the resources to you. Also, what Dr. Ken is doing, Dr. Ken Campos is putting together, is a community. It's a community of caregivers. So they, around the world, internationally, they can really support and help one another. So Dr. Ken, thank you so much for creating this community, and thank you for doing this. Any other thing you'd like to say to your listeners?
Uh, the biggest message is hope. And when I was a resident in psychiatry, I was at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, which is a famous facility. And after 4 years, I thought, what in the world is different here? And what it was the attitude, certainly the competency, but the integrated care and the installation of hope to patients with various kinds of physical and mental illnesses. And so that's what I plan to bring, and that's the intention of this podcast, is to bring hope to those suffering with the mental illness and their caregivers. Thank you, Heather.
Absolutely. And this is Dr. Ken Campos, and you're listening to Hope on the Other Side of the Door podcast.